Welcome back to Ranking Every Doctor Who Story Ever. This is episode 12. As always, this list just reflects my opinion, and it's totally fine if your list looks different than mine. Now, let's get right into it. In 135th place, I have Utopia / The Sound of Drums / Last of the Time Lords. The new show's only true three-parter has some major ups and some major downs. On the positive side, Utopia is a near-flawless episode with an all-time great cliffhanger. Also, I love John Sim in the role of the Master. Furthermore, the fact that the Master, at least for a while, actually got to win allowed him to earn some of his cred back after losing pitifully in most of his classic appearances. Meanwhile, Martha has a strong showing, getting a pretty epic initial send-off story. While her final scene was pretty mundane, I loved it. Instead of some convoluted timey-wimey stuff, she simply made the mature decision that traveling in the TARDIS was no longer good for her. Moving on, the Master's death scene is quite emotional. Seeing how desperate the Doctor is to save the Master after all he did really shows how traumatic it was for the Doctor to lose his entire species. On the flip side, this story's main weakness is its resolution. While the network thankfully allowed for at least some sort of scientific explanation, it does still kind of feel like evangelism saved the world. Also, the time reversal thing was quite Deus Ex Machina, but I can forgive that, as the show would never really be able to have stories on a scale like this set in the present without being able to mostly reverse everything by the end. Overall, it's far from perfect, but as a return for the Master, it works quite well. Moving to 134th, I'm going with Robot of Sherwood. Doctor Who would get old really quickly if every episode had the campiness and lightheartedness of this one. However, most of the rest of Series 8 is decidedly not lighthearted, so this story serves as an extremely enjoyable, funny, and charming change of pace. It unfortunately plays a bit into the main problem I have with Series 8, that is, making the Doctor too abrasive, but at least in this story, it's used pretty well. Moving to 133rd, the only Doctor Who story broadcast in 2019, Resolution. I honestly consider this to be the best true Dalek story since the Russell T Davies era. Sure, I prefer the Day of the Doctor and the Pandorica Opens, but Daleks are not really the main focus of those stories. In this story, thanks to the title, the presence of a Dalek is a mystery, and it's fun to work it out. The scene where the Dalek is shown on Lynn's body is genuinely creepy. I love the idea of the Dalek creating a shell for itself out of spare parts, and while the ultimate result wasn't the greatest looking Dalek ever, it's forgivable since it was meant to look like it was made out of junk. Similarly to Dalek, the damage that this singular Dalek does really helps to emphasize the threat posed by the species. Jodie is quite good in her first Dalek story. I love seeing her and the Dalek repeatedly countering each other's moves. Also, this story is the first time I really got a sense of her old age, which is the one major thing I thought was lacking from her character in Series 11. That being said, this story is not perfect. While I actually quite enjoy the characters of Mitch and Lynn, they seemed unnecessary in an already crowded TARDIS. Furthermore, it would have been cool to see one of the regulars get taken over by the Dalek and have the opportunity to play the villain. The stuff with Ryan and his dad was a bit ham-fisted, and the microwave saving the day comes off as contrived, but the final climax is pretty compelling, and I can forgive the cheesiness to some degree, as it is a holiday special. Moving to 132nd, I have Ghost Light. While I had to read this story's wiki page to fully understand what happened, it's ultimately quite a good story. The dark Victorian haunted house atmosphere makes it a perfect story for a dark, stormy night. Also, the theme of resistance to change is an interesting one, and the Seventh Doctor delivers one of his trademark scheming performances. While the story could have worked better with fewer characters and plot lines, it's a unique story with a lot to love. Into 131st, I'm going with The Rescue. This is a short but effective story that introduces a new and underrated companion. Plus, even though it's a small thing, I love how this story showed alien animals. Most of the time, so-called alien planets either have Earth animals or only have one species. Any effort to make an alien planet feel more alien is appreciated. Moving to 130th, I have Rosa. When I first heard that there was going to be a Doctor Who story on this topic, I was worried that the show might take the very recent piece of history that's still relevant to social problems today and mix it with some sort of alien invasion, which likely would have been very tacky. Thankfully, the show chose not to do that. A criminal trying to reverse the course of the civil rights movement was, at least in theory, a pretty clever way to deal with a sensitive historical topic while still incorporating science fiction. However, the premise did have one fatal flaw. The story basically implied that had the December 1st protest been stopped, the entire civil rights movement might have been prevented, which is preposterous. There's no doubt Rosa Parks had a big part to play in the movement, but she didn't just happen to be angry on one random day. Had she not gotten the chance to protest on December 1st, she absolutely would have done it on another day, because she was an active, dedicated, and conscious contributor to the civil rights movement. Even without her, people like Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, and hundreds of thousands of other African Americans still would have pushed the movement forward. On the positive side, this story serves as a pretty unfiltered depiction of racism in the American South, and it even took some time to address present-day racism. Yes, that exists. If you don't believe it, do some research. However, the main reason I like this story is that all three companions have unique journeys. When you have a TARDIS crew of 3 people from the same city on the same planet in the same time period, they're all going to have pretty similar experiences and perspectives when they visit most places in time and space. But in this story, we see a black man have to face the full brunt of vicious racism, a Pakistani woman experiencing a different but still awful kind of racism, and a white man who gets an amplified view of his privilege. But the idea that stopping Rosa from protesting on one specific day would have stopped her and everyone else from achieving what they achieved is crazy. Moving to 129th, I have Time Heist. This is an extremely fun and unique story with 2 awesome supporting characters in Sai and Sabra. However, the actual plot was a bit convoluted, and I'm not usually a fan of bootstrap paradox style resolutions. Moving to 128th, I have The Reboss Operation. This is a very charming story. The set and costumes provide a nice atmosphere, the pairings of the Doctor and Romana, and Garen and Unstaff make for multiple amusing sequences, and the smallness of the story is a nice contrast to the extensiveness of the Key to Time plot as a whole. The 30-year seasons were also a nice touch. As I often say, the show usually doesn't incorporate enough unearthly qualities when building alien planets. Moving on, the scene where Unstaff tells the Galileo of Reboss that he is right about the universe is quite a moving scene. The only things I didn't like about this story were the Seeker, because I'm not a fan of seeing psychics make correct predictions if their powers go unexplained, and the somewhat underwhelming ending. But overall, it's an entertaining story with high rewatch potential. Moving to 127th, I have The Woman Who Fell to Earth. I'm pretty conflicted about this one. As a story in and of itself, I quite like it. Tim Shaw's reason for being on Earth was quite interesting and broke from the traditional invasion trope. The climax was pretty enthralling, and, most importantly, Jodie Whittaker is quite charming in her debut. The story finds the right level of post-regeneration weirdness, enough to establish the identity crisis that comes with the regeneration, but not too much to make the Doctor into a maniac. All that being said, this story still frustrates me because it sets up one of the main problems with the Whittaker era. That is, it introduces 3 companions from the same city on the same planet in the same time period. This incredibly homogeneous combination of companions causes a lot of dullness later on. If the show wanted 3 companions, they all should have been from different times and planets. Also, the simple idea of introducing 3 companions in a story that also introduces a new Doctor was not a good one. There were simply too many characters to develop. Yaz in particular gets very little focus compared to what a companion usually gets in their first story. Also, one of the 2 most intriguing characters, Grace, ends up dying an avoidable death. Her and Graham would have made a far more interesting TARDIS team than the one we got. Moving to 126th, I have Face the Raven. Some Doctor Who stories are made better by the existence of other stories, while others are made worse by the existence of other stories. Face the Raven is an example of the latter. While the story is certainly still a powerful, well-written, and fitting end for Clara, well, temporary end anyway, it's made less special by the plethora of other Moffat-era stories that feature a companion death in some form. The main reason Adric's death in Earthshock was so shocking and unforgettable is that companion deaths just didn't really happen in the classic era. While I'm not necessarily against companion deaths, their overuse muddles the effect of each individual instance. While I still like Face the Raven, it could have been so much better if there weren't all those other companion deaths or pseudo-deaths that simply make Clara's death less impactful. Moving on from Clara's death, the story is pretty solid otherwise. Riggsy is a fun character and he's nice to have back. The atmosphere of the street is quite good, and the attitudes bred by the totalitarian nature of the street feel very real, even though the reason for the street's existence isn't that well explained. Moving to 125th, I have The Doctor's Daughter. This story has several issues. For starters, the creation of Jenny was rushed simply so that it could be used for the cold open. Secondly, several things seem to happen purely for plot convenience, such as the Hath kidnapping Martha, or the fact that not a single soldier lived for more than a day or two. Statistically speaking, someone should have lived for the whole week, just by chance. All that being said, this story has more good than bad. It works pretty well as a character study of the Doctor. Donna is also phenomenal in this story. While Donna is always good, the story seemed like it would focus more on the Doctor and Jenny, but Donna had one of her best performances because of her hilarious insults and because she was the one who figured out the war only lasted a week. Speaking of which, while I think they should have made the time frame a bit longer so that it was more believable, the idea was quite clever. It was reminiscent of two underrated classic stories, The Face of Evil and Full Circle. Moving to 124th, I'm going with Daleks in Manhattan and Evolution of the Daleks. This story has a pretty poor reputation, but I actually like a lot of things about it. Yes, the pig slaves are silly, the Doctor electrocuting himself to inject his DNA into the hybrids is hard to accept even for a sci-fi show, and some of the American accents are less than great. However, for the most part, I love what this story does with the Daleks. By creating a humanized Dalek sect, it forced the Daleks to choose between their two most innate instincts, obedience to authority and the maintenance of Dalek purity. Dalek sect's rapid change into a good guy felt rushed, but it did allow for the interesting character examination of the other Daleks. Ultimately, despite all of the problems this story has, the fact that it causes Daleks to have an internal conflict really helps to understand them as villains. Moving up to 123rd, I have Knock Knock. This story's spooky, haunted house aesthetic makes it a tense, captivating watch, but my favorite thing about it is actually the climax. The reveal that the landlord was going to all these lengths just to save his mother made for a nice, refreshing villain motivation. Instead of someone wanting to make money or take over the world or something, this villain is motivated by a simple human emotion that we can all sympathize with. That being said, he was still in the wrong, and this story shows that. It's a nice reminder that good intentions don't necessarily justify something. Also, I was glad that Bill's friends were all resurrected at the end, as a story where 5 innocent college kids die would have been a bit dark for my taste. In 122nd place, I have The Three Doctors. As a part of the show as a whole, this is a wonderful story. It unites multiple Doctors for the first time, it introduces us to Omega and some Time Lord history, and it restores the Doctor's ability to travel in time. However, the story itself is decidedly more conventional. Pertwee and Troughton are hilarious together, and it's really fun to see Benton and the Brigadier actually travel in the TARDIS, but the plot isn't really anything too special. It's just a run-of-the-mill, Doctor faces a threat and figures out a clever way to defeat it type story. However, despite that, it's still a delightful story to watch due to the presence of the Three Doctors. And to finish off the episode, in 121st, I have The Ark. This story's strong points are its interesting premise and its structure of having its two halves set 700 years apart. It's a story that's both timey-wimey but easily comprehensible at the same time. The Doctor addressing the fact that the monoids were somewhat justified in rising up also contributes to this story's merits. Overall, this is a bit of an underrated gem. Alright, that is going to do it for episode 12. Make sure to subscribe if you want to help out my channel and see the rest of the list. This was the last episode of a production block, so it might be a bit of time before I upload episode 13. See you then.